Hello. Welcome to another Museum FAQ video. I'm Paul Orselli, President and Chief Instigator of POW, Paul Orselli Workshop, here on Long Island. And lucky me to be joined this morning by Laura Huerta Migus. Laura, I always like people to start out. I think it's always interesting to hear about their background and how they got involved in what they do. So maybe we could start out there.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Laura, and I'm currently the Executive Director of the Association of Children's Museums based in Arlington, Virginia. What's the long story short is that I Forrest Gumped my way into museum work back about 20 years ago. And really what's my driver is doing advocacy work around educational equity. And I did that for a little while in the formal education space, and then got really lucky to get a job in the children's museum space. And then that was my introduction to the museum world. And it became my community ever since. And I've spent that almost 20 years really focusing on elevating the conversations about diversity and equity in museum work as my primary driver. And that took me to a couple of different organizations, including Aztec, the Association of Science Technology Centers, before coming back home to ACM about almost 6 years ago now.
Okay, great. Well, maybe especially since now you're the head of ACM and you've worked in different aspects of the museum business, I thought it would be great to hear your perspective and to talk a little bit today, and maybe especially during these times, which are interesting and tricky times, about just to get some thoughts about how to build maybe stronger and more resilient organizations, some things that you think and your experience, especially, I'm sure, both in your work at ACM and Aztec, you encountered lots of fellow professionals and saw a wide range of museums. Some things that stand out for you as both a leader and an observer about the qualities of strong and resilient organizations.
Yeah, it's a really good question because the one thing I forgot to share in my background is that one of the things that struck me as I came into the museum field so many years ago, I don't know how as a 20-year-old I was able to form this thought, or 20-something, but I did, was that museums are really complex, really complicated organizations. I mean, even having worked in and seen the public school systems and how complicated those are, a school is, museums really have the same level of complexity. And it actually inspired me to pursue my graduate work in organizational development, because at the association level, right, our job is to try to answer this question, right? How can you be the most resilient, sustainable, thriving museum that you can be? And I realized that there wasn't a lot of resources or evidence that was being offered to museums, even still, right, as we're generating our own knowledge. But I think there are a few principles generally that come out of the OD world that I see when you think about the most thriving museums. Even during crises, there are a few key components, and maybe they'll take different priority or manifestation, but what I think we see in the institutions that are the most resilient, whether that be through disaster or just changing trends, et cetera, is that first and foremost, they are totally committed to understanding their customers. And that's sort of the bigger OD word, but we'd say audiences. that commitment is really critical, because that creates that sort of adaptability and being in touch, um, to provide the services, right? And to be able to pivot. So I think that's one. Um, the second is having a museums that have great relationships with the people that run the museum, and that power that system. So a lot of human-centered approaches really is like, where are you putting the people at the center? And then I'd say third, and I do think that this sort of is the underlying priority, is then the idea is the museums that have a really clear vision for what they do. Like, what's their role? What's their strength? What's their expertise? What do they do? Um, and if you have those three things, um, I see those are the museums that, can really articulate what they're really about. Their team really gets it and is really committed to it. And all of that effort is really focused on service to who their audiences are. I think over the years, those are the museums that have really figured out how to be strong, have great reputations, and that's also regardless of size. Some of those things, those are practices that can happen at any level. And those are the things, I think, as I was going to grad school, I was like, yes, I'm finding the literature that's putting words to, when we know, like, that's a great museum. Not just that their stuff is great, but we know that they're great. It's like, oh, right, well, there's actually a framework for that. So I think those are the three things that come to mind when I think about what makes a sustainable organization. Those are really the top three factors I see.
I'm just smiling because those are the kinds of things that I try and think about when I'm developing an exhibition. Also, you want to think about your audience, you want to think about who the people are on your team, and you want to have a clear sense of your big idea, your framing purpose, your North Star there. So I think that's interesting. Probably you can break out those same qualities into every aspect of museum work, whether it's educational programs or exhibit development or what have you. So that I'm glad to hear that those are really three strong qualities that stand out and are supported by your sense of the literature and that aspect of things. Now I'll just throw you a nice hard question, which is, okay, so those are certainly the things you want to keep in mind, and those are sort of the ideal things. But how do you pivot to that when you are in the midst of a crisis? Here's a national disaster,
Yeah.
a tornado hits your museum, or there's an economic crisis, or there's a worldwide pandemic, and maybe you were transitioning or really working on those things, or even if you are a museum who had all those things lined up perfectly, you are still impacted in difficult ways by a crisis or by a natural disaster. What are your thoughts about working your way out of that situation, or persevering, being resilient, I guess, is maybe another way of saying it?
Yeah, I think so. Let me think about how to answer that. Here's what I'm seeing, right? So we're at a month in, and I think it's fair to say that it was like, getting sucker punched for most of us, and it was a knockout. Like, it was one punch, and we were all flat on
I was gonna say an atom bomb, but
yeah, we were flat on our backs, right? And that's our entire industry, right? Not just the children's museum community, but I can really speak about what I'm seeing from this segment of the community, with respect to sort of those three areas. And what's really been tremendous to me, and I think this is a strength of the children's museum field, is that um, certainly in the human-centered approaches, our whole discipline is focused around a very specific type of person or people. So we're by definition audience oriented. We're also a very high overhead when it comes to people driven experience because of the hands-on nature and highly facilitated experiences. So there's a lot of people involved um, in a great children's museum experience. And our sector, uh, maybe more than some other sectors, because we're so dependent on people, have also been incredibly devastated when it comes to staffing and workforce reductions and layoffs that have already, been instituted or are being instituted as we speak. And here's what I've seen around these flavors that I have never seen in the wake of mass layoffs, so many people who have been laid off thank their organizations for the time that they had with them. Um, and I don't know if you've been seeing those same things, like today was my last day at, X X Children's Museum or Science Center. And I'm so proud. I was like, who gives that exit interview, publicly? And I think that says a lot about what those places are as places to work, right? And so what I see is that the staff that are retained in those really hard situations with those museums that have had to do a lot of really tough reductions, is that the staff that is remaining have been able to come back and not recover, but start immediately to go into entrepreneurial mode. So there is some really strong basis there that they are figuring out, how do we get online when we've sort of pushed away from being around virtually because we're hands-on experiences. So they're able to pivot and improvise. They feel like they've got a strong foundation and are starting to improvise for the mission and survival of their organization. So, what I see, and we don't know what the success is yet. We're so at the beginning of this whole process that I don't know what is going to have long-term positive effects. But what we do see from those people gathering and figuring out what to do next. And I will say that they're being very driven by staff. It's not top down necessarily direction on what should be happening. There's a lot of shepherding of creativity. And that, so those organizations who are really like, they feel like they've got a clear idea, clear mission, and they've got staff that are with that mission, are figuring out what to do with their audiences. And then I'm seeing others, like for example, the Creative Discovery Museum in Chattanooga. They're part of a project, the CCLI project, and they're a part of this cohort of museums that is just finishing out their time in CCLI. And we had the opportunity to have a conversation with that group of museums a couple weeks ago and just checking in. And, they paused and took a moment before they figured out how to rally to go out and do community canvassing. What are your needs? So let's not assume that we know what we need to do. Let's go out and really talk to some critical stakeholders in our community, and then let's rally around that. So I think there's something about thinking, like there's a way of thinking that is really critical. What do we have and what do people need in this time? Because I think it's arguable. I think we feel like museums are critical and they're necessary services. I think it's really hard for the general population, whether that be audiences or policyholders, to understand why and what we can do in these moments of crisis. And so I think there's also this really interesting moment where we have an opportunity to prove that. And I'm seeing museums, certainly children's museums, show they're showing up. and not just on online activities, but in other really interesting ways that I think is going to be really powerful.
Well, and I like that you drew that line between children's museums being very audience focused, and of course, it's been attributed to Mike Spock and other people that the name of our audience is in the name of who we are. You know, we're children's museums. But I think also what you said about the Chattanooga example is that, you know, you can't really be an effective organization if you're just putting forth a monolithic response. Like, what do our communities need? What are the things where with our audience that they really want and need from us? So I think that's really an important point, and it
Yeah.
reflects back on the qualities that you mentioned earlier. Maybe one last thing to I'd be interested in hearing from you about, especially as it relates to children's museums, but maybe more broadly about all museums and cultural organizations, is that now we're in sort of this transition time. People are, for the most part, at home, and museums are closed. So there are opportunities to engage with our audiences now, and then one day, who knows when that day is, who knows what it will look like, who knows how it will phase in. Museums will reopen in one way, shape, or form, and then audiences will return to us. I'm wondering, in both those cases, both in this transition time and in the sort of new era, the new normal, so-called, um, how we can help our audiences, especially children and their adult caregivers, um, to build up some of their own resiliency through our programming or through our interactions with our visitors.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So there are some people might be familiar with this, but there's been a lot of work in the public health and in the medical community about building up, identifying these experiences that are called ACEs, right? Adverse childhood experiences. And there's been this work where they've identified anywhere between 7 to 10 ACEs. And these ACEs are correlated with long-term health outcomes into adulthood, and those are both physical as well as mental health outcomes. And this situation has the potential to trigger or it's trauma. It's really about trauma, right? And this is a traumatic experience for many of us. And there are lots of families and children that are already experiencing a lot of trauma, you know, food insecurity and unstable and maybe unhealthy caregiver and family environments that are already having impacts on kids. And all of us are now in an environment that makes it more possible for some of those adverse experiences to be happening in our households. And I bring those up because one of the most um, effective buffers, that idea of creating resilience. So there are ways, there are interventions and things, other experiences that happen in our lives that help buffer the negative impact of those experiences. And maybe the most important is having a positive relationship with an adult for a child. That's like the number one, the number one. So I think what I'm seeing, certainly, and as our sector is figuring out its role in those, how do we reach those visitors, that audience in the best way and what they need, is that I'm seeing more people being able to say, you know, what parents need are not lessons, particularly for their children. They don't need lessons like, here's how to teach your child about gravity. Content is good, but the interaction that we're inviting them to should be one of respite. So maybe this is giving the parents a rest And there are ways to engage a child so that the adult can get a rest, and be refreshed, and everybody gets refreshed, um, as well as activities that are engaging the adult and the child in a positive relationship during that experience. So story times are a great example of that, where we're creating spaces through our virtual outreach for the parent to be the kind of natural teacher that we ask them to be when they come to our places. So how can we help them create that at home, even for just a moment? Because we know also that that experience doesn't have to be all day, every day. It just has to be regular. um, and so I think if we think about this whole experience through that lens, like what is giving people respite? What is giving people the opportunity to create positive relationship, even with each other, even between adults? I think there is so much opportunity with our art museums or museums of any type with their content. What can you do to help people talk and connect to each other? And your content is just the vehicle, right? So
Yeah.
it's the same thing. It's like that social cultural learning. It's just like we can do that still with our stuff. And I think we're learning to do it in really different ways.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you just said. Again, I'm resonating with my own experiences when I was doing my teaching field work in Detroit, and some with kids and families in really difficult situations. And at a low point, I remember speaking with my lead teacher and the school counselor and the principal, like, really, how can I be helpful to these kids beyond jumping around and doing science tricks? And the two things they said really echo what you said. They said one is to just model a positive relationship between myself and my lead teacher, who happened to be a woman. So here are two adults interacting with each other in positive ways. And then also, we were able to, maybe even more than I was supposed to as a master's degree student doing my fieldwork, bring our classes out to museums and other places, because that was really the other piece of advice that echoes yours, which is to show people places and things outside of their everyday experience, to show them that the world is wider than just the 4-block radius that they live in, and that there are wonderful things in the world and new things to find out about and ways to interact with it, that they might not have even thought about. So yeah, I think that's also a great takeaway. Well, thanks, Laura. I think that's great. Do you have any closing thoughts to wrap us out with?
Yeah, I think I have a couple of very short closing thoughts. And we've all been forced to think about ourselves in new ways and what sustainability is going to look like. Um, I keep when this is over. I don't know when this is over, but when we get back to a place that feels like our new baseline, and I think we have a real opportunity across the industry in all museums to make this a seminal moment. Um, I I would ask people to not plan for what it looked like before. This is a real opportunity to reinvent yourself, especially around being essential. Um, we talk about museum experiences bringing joy and are restorative, but we have a moment to really articulate and prove how we are of service and how we are healing environments, and the place that we really occupy in society. Um, and if we embrace that, we have an opportunity to come out of this um, so much stronger, as not only individual institutions, but as an entire field. And so I think that's the challenge that I hold in myself to get myself through these weeks, and that I see the leadership in our field really holding on to as well. And so I think I'd like to leave that as a positive thought and a challenge for all of us.
I like that positive thought and challenge. And I like that I was able to speak with you today and you were able to take the time. Thanks very much, Laura. I appreciate it.
Oh, thanks, Paul, for asking me. It's been a pleasure. Even I had to make myself up earlier than I've had to, but that's a good
you and me both.
challenge for me.
Oh, that's great. Thanks again.
All right. Thanks, Paul.